Bonsoir. Hello. My name is Lev Bratishenko. Je m'appelle Lev Bratishenko. Je suis le conservateur public de CCA. C'est un plaisir de vous accueillir ce soir à la conversation. My name is Lev Bratishenko. I'm the curator public here at CCA, so welcome to this conversation. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the context for what follows and explain what we're doing here. But basically, after I talk, then Haidee and Charles will give brief presentations, about 15 minutes, and then we have sort of the headliner for tonight, Rick Prelinger. Then we'll have a short conversation on stage, take some questions also from you, également en français. Je vais essayer de traduire le meilleur que je peux. So today, we can say there's some debate over the correct role for universities in society. We're in a moment of skepticism. Many institutions under attack for failing to produce what the Fabians called brain workers. There's all kinds of problems you can have with this. In this context, to some, the kind of technological solutions like massive open online courses are a kind of a best case outcome of austerity politics. But they could be wrong. I'd like to suggest they are. Here at the CCA, we're interested in kind of finding and proposing alternatives to contemporary crises, and in the institution of the museum as a kind of a productive place for the historical recovery of relevant ideas for today. So today's discussion was inspired by a research project and exhibition last fall on one such institution, the Open University. So to expand the conversation around these projects, we often invite other people to talk to us about them, to kind of understand them in new ways, to initiate dialogues. And in this case, obviously, universities are a very relevant partner to talk about these things with. So we had the first of these conversations at the University of Toronto in the fall. That was called The School That Never Was. And we had a second in Lisbon. So each finds new points of contact and takes a new spin. So tonight we're sort of talking to, well, maybe I won't say all of Concordia, but a very relevant part of Concordia University. Perhaps the fun part. So what, I'm just going to tell you about what the Open University was, and these things will kind of go on behind me as I talk about the story, hopefully quickly. So the Open University was a political project of the 1960s, project of the Labour government in the United Kingdom. And basically it used kind of centralized, institutionalized, mediated forms of pedagogy in an effort to improve society specifically by providing access to university courses at home. This is not what the 60s are best known for, certainly not to me. And it represents a very interesting confluence of roughly three movements in post-war culture in the UK, sort of adult education, broadcasting education, and movements towards more egalitarian education. It all began as a manifesto by the Labour politician and later Prime Minister Haidee Wasson in 1963. He proposed a new national university of the air, so-called, to be taught over radio, television, correspondence courses by mail, and through regional study centers. This was primarily a way for working class people to access higher education, where they would not be otherwise going to schools good enough to get into universities afterwards. The Scottish politician Jenny Lee was given the final task of kind of producing this institution on paper when she was became the Minister for the Arts in 1966. And that's when she produced her famous white paper, and when the University of the Air was transformed into the Open University, which was an emphatic change to suggest not only an openness to new kinds of people, so breaking the social boundaries that were limiting the universities at the time, but also an openness to new ideas. Something I found very interesting is they frequently refer to themselves at this time as an educational conspiracy. There were other important factors. Among them, this was a moment of kind of elite anxiety about the corrosive influence of commercial, primarily American-made television that was sort of invading the UK, some people thought. And of course, the Open University was created by labor leaders who come up through kind of traditional industrial trade unionism. So it's a little surprised that it was quite a centralized project. Another important factor in that was that it was grafted onto the BBC. which is a massive public institution. This created many interesting possibilities for distribution, but it created many problems as there were sort of some cultural differences between the two. However, it did mean that put on prime time, this guaranteed a mass audience for these courses, something that really never happened before. So when it opens in 1969, after a few years of sort of institutional definition and kind of basic coursework being produced by course teams, there's 25,000 places available for students. By 1984, it was already Britain's largest university with 100,000 students. It was never advertised. The Open University was not something that you searched for. It was something that you found on television, often when you were a bit drunk coming home from the bar. Initially, most of the actual students were from the fields of education that had heard about it first, but over the first 10 years, the demographics changed dramatically. Interestingly, there was almost gender parity. It was the first university to offer enrollment without any prerequisites. There was no exam, there was no diploma required. And it was also the first to allow prisoners to study. To compensate for this lack of prerequisites, there were sort of foundation courses that were designed in the kind of core areas, math and arts and sciences and humanities. And all of this we presented here as an exhibition through a case study, which was a study of the third-year arts course, A305, The History of Architecture and Design, 1890 to 1939. So this was a new reading, a very interesting reading of modern architecture for a previously marginalized public. Now, the Open University itself was physically located in a kind of modernist, late modernist case study, which was the new town of Milton Keynes. This was sort of remarkably anti-pedestrian, and it was completed under Thatcher. And it's supposed to represent what we now refer to as a sort of knowledge economy. So it was a campus without students, for teachers without classrooms. And all of this, it was also kind of closer to a factory in how it operated. The OU was the biggest publisher and printer for a while in the UK. It even had its own post office. The local office quickly realized they couldn't handle the volume that was going through it. They were sending about 30 tons of mail each week. So you would sign up for a class and you would receive boxes of material, which could be glassware to do your science experiments at home, as I think you see in the photo eventually. Could be samples, could be chemicals, could be all kinds of materials to read along. And then you would do assignments and exams, primarily over mail. For A305, the fact that a lot of this material was visual presented some specific problems. So they had 12 course booklets that were illustrated in black and white, and each was accompanied by a little 16mm film strip that was in color with a kind of a cheap plastic DIY kind of projector that you could hold up to the light. There were also radio vision booklets, which is what you'd read while you were listening to the radio episodes. Other books for reading when you're looking at when you're watching the TV, because they'll make reference to them. And then an anthology of primary source text as well. So despite all these students who were all over the UK, they're being separated in space, they would become sort of synchronized in time at specific broadcast moments if they followed all the episodes of one course. There were some opportunities to catch, we're in sync, to catch missed episodes. So this is an image of one. Basically, these tutors would travel around in specific regions and they would set up these portable, that was a reel-to-reel film projector. And then students would gather for these discussions to catch missed episodes, to ask each other questions, and to have this sort of experience they can't have at home. When Tim Benton was here introducing the project to us, he told a wonderful story about how actually if you were a student, you could call up the Open University and they would give you the phone numbers of other students in the area if you wanted to ask them questions. That sounds incredibly trusting and lovely. There were also summer courses, summer schools that happened on different university campuses, which would be this other sort of rhythm of cohesive moments for students that would otherwise experience the course entirely at home, sometimes alone. So the Open University was sort of flowing over the UK using this machinery of the BBC, but then also appearing in post offices, libraries, halls, and other public infrastructure. Relative to what the BBC was interested in, its audiences were tiny. And this was a point of tension, as you can imagine. So once VHS, oh yes, another moment of synchronization, arrived, and especially once home recorders became available, this was the sort of moment that the BBC was waiting for, and they quickly pushed Open University programming to very, very late night slots. And as the curator of the exhibition, Joachim Moreno, likes to say, then it was just being broadcast to insomniacs and recording machines. The Open University still exists in a fascinatingly distorted form that I won't get into, but after 30 years of neoliberalism, you can imagine things have changed. So tonight, basically, we're having a conversation inspired by its founding ambition, because it's still quite relevant. So this idea of the role of the university as a tool to change society.
Immediately following World War II, everywhere in all realms of life, it seemed that there was a new environment of images and sounds. It seemed like this new world, a new world, was upon so many different contexts, national contexts. The Open University exhibit that Lev was just talking about brought to life a major mass-mediated educational experiment that responded to and worked within that context. Now, in the exhibit, if you had a chance to see it, it was really quite wonderful. You could see all of the various materials and media that were involved. There were examples of the televised lessons, but also all of the essays and workbooks, the individual slide viewers, the 16 mm film strips, maquette kits, and so on. And in fact, I like that one of the part of the iconography of the exhibit, and the image came up several times during the introduction, is the cardboard box, right? And of course, it wasn't just those broadcast shows. It was, in fact, this box that would arrive, and inside there were all of these other materials. Now, the focus of that particular exhibit was arts education, architecture. The Open University covered all sorts of other kinds of different subjects. And it really was one example. There were many other examples in different locations. That was the UK context of efforts to amalgamate new kinds of media forms of extensions teaching. But one of the things that I want to think about is the way in which participating in them, in those kinds of contexts and those kinds of courses, students were learning more than just about the subject matter. And in fact, what they were doing was they were also experiencing, in fact, I would say inhabiting, a particular set of ideas about new teaching methods, about networks, in fact, ideas about distance, ideas about space, and of course, of course, ideas about media. And in fact, that's what I want to emphasize in the time that I have here. I want to ask and sort of cover a little bit of a survey of what was conceptualized as media pedagogy in the 1960s. And I think it's a concept that really importantly informs much of what follows, and in fact, much of what we are dealing with today. If you look at the dominant histories of the 1960s, I think you're going to find that they're populated with college radicals and visionary media artists and spectacular global events. But in fact, the experience and navigation of a new media world that I began by referencing transpired at quite local and proximate contexts. And that one of those vanguard locations for the technological society to come was actually schools. Universities, yes, but at all different levels, elementary schools, high schools, and other kinds of instructional venues. Post-World War II, an array of clunky audiovisual devices became part of the ordinary context of classrooms. And that includes, I have this cluttered image here so you can try to pick them out yourself. Film projectors, opaque and overhead projectors, tachistoscopes, film strips, slide shows, various sound materials, radio records, teaching machines, and television. Now, the post-World War II period was not the first moment of classroom technology, not by any stretch, and certainly there was a long discussion about visual education from the turn of the 20th century onward. But what was different, though, post-World War II, is that it was a moment where you could see beginnings of a settlement of a pedagogical idea settling in relationship to a concept of an emerging global world, global media world, right? And it's a connection, an articulation, if you will, that becomes dominant by the 1960s, right? So from that mid-1940s onward through until a moment of dominance in the 1960s. And I should add, too, that I'm specifically talking about the American context, which is important here, not only because it was a site of innovation for this language, these ideas, but also because of the importance of American ideals around a new form of media pedagogy as something to be exported, right? So something that circulated internationally. This was not automatic. This was not the product of new technologies or new technological potential only. It was the product of a new generation of AV, audiovisual educational theorists who vigorously advocated for the modernization of the classroom. They vigorously argued for the obsolescence of the little red schoolhouse, as they referred to it, argued for the busting out of the school walls, and doing so by a broad acceptance of a new idea about media literacy. It's a term that they actually begin to use certainly by the end of the 1950s, early 1960s. What they're seeing are educational prospects that are different from those of the past, very much informed by new media, but of course also understood as being appropriate to the new emerging world, right? So it's important to understand that one of the things that's transpiring here, one of the explicit objectives was not only, I mean, certainly part of the rhetoric was about being able to teach a wider array of things, teach better, teach faster. There are all of these terms that are deployed. But it was also about producing an appropriate citizen for the new technological environment that was developing. All right, so let me try to provide some of the conceptualization of what were those emerging ideas about media pedagogy. Well, AV education, AV instruction, technologized classrooms were very much posed against an argument about automation. They were posed against an argument about mechanized teaching. They were posed against an argument about standardization of lesson delivery. And I emphasize this because I've seen people looking at this material and seeing the exact opposite, right? That in fact, this was all about robot teachers and so on. No, it was quite explicitly posed against it. It was a brand of, and this term emerges, returns again and again, it was a brand of experiential learning. Experience in teaching is one of the key terms here. AV spaces were designed to not be fixed. They were designed to be flexible, participatory classroom environments. It's one of the reasons why you see the proliferation of carts, right? It's one of the reasons why you see the proliferation of retractable screens, right? AV altered how one sat in a room, whether in rapt attention or in the more casual posture that you can see in this particular image. This really becomes dominant in the 1960s, incorporated in what's referred to as informal learning, right? The idea that unstructured learning becomes a new way in which to imagine what a curriculum might offer. And architecturally or in terms of design, this is best represented in what's referred to as the open concept classroom. And I think you can see that in this particular image, right? This idea that within a space, students would be involved in different kinds of activities, different kinds of media engagement. And of course, that would change, right, throughout the day, depending on the lesson, depending on the pedagogical goal. Media pedagogy could be directed to groups of students, or it could be directed to individuals. It could be self-guided instruction, as in this case with a film slide viewer, or in a teaching machine, which were teaching machines which were all the rage in the early 1960s through the 60s until they realized how ineffective they were for the goals that they were hoping to achieve, and most of them were trashed by the early 1970s. Bodily variation bodily variability in seating, in movement. This was normalized. This was encouraged, with teachers and students alike orienting themselves differently depending upon the demands of the machine and demands of the lesson. Right? The emphasis here was a dynamic relationship between teachers, pupils, and environments. Some AV teaching plans enlisted students to conduct, of course, their own lessons, right? They become deputized, if you will, as their own teachers or as teachers of one another. Understand, though, that in that process, part of what's transpiring is the requirement of a certain kind of mastery of the protocols of the particular, not only the lesson, but also whatever the device happens to be, right? So again, back to where I started, there's an element here where part of the education involves learning about the technological apparatus at the same time. Other lessons had students making their own audiovisual materials as part of the learning task, which could include recordings, transparencies, photographs, film. Students were often recruited as teaching and technology assistants, helping set up and run the equipment. Again, as I described, in being enlisted into the process by which this technological apparatus, this instructional apparatus, was organized and constructed. This image here, you can see a teacher working on preparing their teaching material, and here, of course, is a student assisting with teacher preview circumstance. Now, combined, the range of AV materials and procedures shifted learning to encompass the particularities of a variable technological apparatus. Right? So moving to the center then of this emerging media pedagogy set of ideas is a question of systematicity. It's an approach that was grounded in integration of varying orientations and possibilities of uses of instructional technology. It's a concept built into this dominant idea about media pedagogy that it keeps returning to an idea of the multimedia. Right? And I think that this is often when historians look back at this, they will often be medium specific, right? So they'll talk about the classroom film, right, or the radio broadcaster. But in fact, most of these programs were designed to be something that one would move among these different forms, right? And you have to think about those kind of media systems. I'm just going to show you a little clip here. From a film out of, actually it's part of a series of films from Ohio State University. This was, it's called Teacher and Technology. And in fact, these were a series of films that were constructed to teach teachers about the coming age of instructional technology. And they're quite terrific documents about some of the aspirations for these devices and these materials. And as you're looking at this clip, please pay attention to some of the key words that I've already mentioned that I think you'll hear reiterated here again. Let me just see, I have to go to, you can see this? All right, can I make this big? That'll do. This runs about 3.5 minutes here. And this is specifically a little documentary portrait of the technological teaching environment at an Air Force college in Colorado. This would have been filmed in 1965 in the film 1964-65. And the complete film was released in 1966. All right, so let's take a look at this.
Here at the Air Force Academy, we look on the teacher's role as that of a manager of instructional resources or a manager of the student's environment.
The Audiovisual Center at the Air Force Academy is based on the concept of the centralization of instructional materials and facilities under the direction of a media specialist. But the objective is to put instructional technology under the control of the individual classroom teacher. For example, specialized models, charts, and displays are tailor-made to instructor specifications in the center's workshops. The graphics division creates instructor-inspired designs for film strips, overhead transparencies, and text materials and illustrations for classroom handbooks. The center also includes a library of 3,000 motion pictures with preview facilities for individual instructors who make the final evaluation and selection of films for classroom use. The multimedia approach of the center is expressed in the variety and types of visual and auditory equipment available to the instructor, including a complete closed-circuit television system within the complex of Academy classroom buildings. The concept of teacher-centered service is most clearly seen in the Academy's instructor-centered television studio. Here, the instructor is in command of films, slides, charts, graphs, and his own image as he programs his own selection of materials, using one preset floor camera and a second overhead camera, which he controls from the teaching console. The presentation is then recorded on videotape for later transmission to the classroom.
Numerous misconceptions concerning the nature of poetry and the role that it must play in coming to terms with ourselves and coming to terms with the society in which we live. We've prepared this tape for you as a kind of introduction to the poetry block. What it purports to do is merely to stimulate an interest, perhaps get you to the point of asking questions concerning the nature of poetry, and then I hope during the block we'll be able to supply some of the answers.
Crowns have their compass, length of days their date, triumphs their tomb, felicity her fate. Of naught but earth can earth make us partaker, but knowledge makes a king most like his maker.
That, you say, is poetry. No doubt, right? I mean, it sounds stately enough, and after all, it is Shakespeare. But then what about this? An experiment currently going on in New York and San Francisco.
The dog stops reading. In the street, he sees reality, and the things he sees are bigger than himself, and the things he sees are his reality. Looks in doorways, moves on trees.
Television is not used as a primary means of teaching. We believe that teachers teach.
Sense there, and just in case you're curious, that was the beat poetry at the end. There was Lawrence Ferngully's dog, just in case you wanted to know that. Okay, let me see, where was I? Let's go away from this. All right, so you heard some of the, whoops, that's not what there we go. So you heard some of the terms there about systematicity, emphasizing over and over again the idea that instructors, teachers are involved in the making. You heard the instructor-centered, teacher-centered again and again. And of course you get these strange mise en abîme moments where the teacher is sitting there watching with the class with himself on the recorded element there. But you also get a little window too into, I mean, with the African American Air Force personnel of a civil rights era, a new kind of understanding about diversity. It's an era to come. A film like this, only a few years earlier, would have certainly you would have the African American films, then you would have the non-African American films. But here you can start to see a certain merging here, and so there's a way in which the spatial openness of certain kinds of concepts about teaching are also mirrored in some way with other kinds of ideas about perspective and sort of diversity and perspective and voice. I think it should be apparent, though, as well from that clip, the new kind of labor that was expected, right? That the instructional labor was changing. There were new sets of demands and expectations that were required of this experiential media pedagogical system. The teacher was, in a sense, to become a programmer, right, a curator, right, whose work included previewing material, right, evaluating options in relationship to a particular lesson, and then, of course, making the appropriate selections. Here's a quote from a key AV educationalist, Edgar Dale, writing in 1968 on this topic, and he says, quote, "The great revolution going forward today in our schools means a shift in the role of the teacher from a Jack or Jill of all trades to that of a sophisticated organizer, administrator, and stimulator of learning," right? An organizer, an administrator, and a stimulator of learning. One sees that argumentation quite frequently. Teachers are no longer holders of knowledge specifically, right, that's to be imparted to a class. They become managers, and again, you heard that in that clip. They become animators, they become discussion leaders. And most significantly, this media system is not something that arrives intact, right, but requires us, right, teachers and students, to construct it. You know, when you hear this, one has to have an image of all of the ephemera that's produced as a result of this, right? That there may be all of the official holdings that we may find of classroom films and various kinds of lesson plans, but those are only a small portion of the media that would have been produced, again, by the various participants in courses as well as the people directing them. Now, obviously, any new approach to pedagogy or thinking about the goals of lesson plans doesn't sweep in without some pushback. And of course, many people and certainly teachers challenged some of the exaggerated claims about efficiency. Sure, the learning might be faster at a certain point, but in the meantime, I've got to learn how to operate a camera, how to put sound on sync sound with a motion picture. And you saw this most palpable in that many of these changes left a front line of largely female teachers, right? Edgar Dale's gendering of his statement, Jack or Jill of all trades, is not a random thing. It's a front line of largely women teachers, especially at the elementary and high school levels, that are required to implement these new technological methods. Again, that are decided upon by a predominantly male administrative force. And I just happen to like this particular cartoon commentary on exactly this process. You have the teacher sitting there frustrated with a process, and you have the two male administrators looking in, peeking in the classroom door, saying, and of course, very proudly, you see the smiles, and of course, we encourage local production of instructional materials. And you can see the boxes up on the top. It's a do-it-yourself projection kit, and then you see do-it-yourself film kit, and then over here it's print your own books, right? And of course the students now enlisted into this, right? So a little symptomatic representation of some of the frustrations that were associated with this rising dominance of this particular approach to media pedagogy. Now, just to wind up here, some of the key overarching attributes from this period, systematicity, multimedia, flexibility, mobility, diversity, interactivity, participatory, and also making, right? The teacher as a media maker, the student as a media maker, right? Think about the ideological heft of that, right? That on the one hand, you have this process of making these budding citizens of a new technological universe responsible, right, for that technological apparatus that's eventually going to enframe them, right? It seems to me like this is a key element that's developing here. Now, I state all of these key terms in exactly this fashion because I'm hoping that you can hear the echoes with our reigning common sense about wired classrooms and mobile media spaces and media creation. And I'll just end by pointing, isn't it curious that so much of our image of the future and aspirations for the future are so bound up by 50-year-old aspirations? Thank you very much. I'm going to... I will now turn the podium over to Haidee Wasson at the in Cinema Studies at Concordia University.
Thank you so much, Charles. This paper is, it's short, it's a think piece, and it really, Lev used the word corrosive with an understanding that the open university experiment was against the corrosive. And I fear what I've done here is kind of resurrect for him the corrosive against which these kinds of experiments were articulated. But the part of the argument is, of course, that it's important to understand the way some of these very familiar ideas that we, in one iteration, seem very progressive, or in Charles's presentation, more complex, if you will. I think in this instance, we can see the ways in which many of these ideas were very at home in a very corporate world. This is also focused on the United States. So let me just share with you what I have here. So one of the things I wanted to say about the Open University experiment that was so striking to me when I came here to see it, knowing very little about it before I came, was that it combined, as an experiment, recognizable ideas about democratic education or increased access with inexpensive, quotidian, everyday, consumer-grade technologies. Its experiment also included a radical reboot of something old and reliable like the mail. All of these put in service of a kind of experimental learning project. And I guess Charles and I are reading the same books. This experiment arrived in a sturdy box. And for me, I kept thinking about the box and how great the box was as a metaphor for all of this. It was not high tech, but it all marked a major and very imaginative undertaking that combined old and new, major and minor, or small technologies in a very powerful and enduring way. So in the spirit of thinking about these other popular modes of learning through media as they took shape during this same period, I want to focus a little bit on a particular cultural event, and that is the World's Fair in New York in 1964. I want to tend to this event and its media with an eye on the way the fair experimentally combined old and new and could be linked to big media and small through a rather more corporate kind of utopianism than the one that was embodied in the Open University experiment. Now, I should qualify this. World's fairs cannot exactly be said to be neglected or other phenomena. The site-specific, sponsored, large-screen experiments of, say, Expo 67, for instance, have received ample attention lately, especially here in Montreal. That said, fairs in the general sense were highly generative of many multi-mediated experiments, many of which fall outside of these large-scale event logics that have shaped our ideas about World's fairs. Many of these we still know too little about, but I will say, from what I am gathering, they resonate deeply with a good many of the rhetorics we often hear today. Ideas of flipped classrooms, not in those languages, those words, of course, adaptive and experiential learning. We've seen some of that in Charles's presentation, hybridity, and an emphasis on multi-mediated presentations or lectures. Such expanded, tactile, immersive modes of learning have long been enduring elements of World's fairs. And indeed, throughout the 20th century, not just in the 1960s, these pedagogical experiments were put in service of an expansive public, invited to adapt to a rapidly changing technological age. The primary medium, if you will, of World's fairs and exhibitions is the exhibit or the installation. Many of them were themselves multi-mediated, so it's a complex term, as anybody who's ever worked on putting an exhibit together knows. And I also want to add that often these exhibits, themselves multi-mediated, were often part of whole media ecologies that helped to expand the nature of the fair itself across time and space. So in other words, exhibits themselves lived as postcards, as stereoscopes, as photographs, as radio programming, as television, sound recordings, and film. So fairs didn't end when the gates closed. They continued on in many other ways. To be sure, fairs and expositions are not examples either of what we conventionally call educational institutions. But the deep and enduring relationship among didactic display, popular engagement, and new technologies is utterly foundational to them. This includes a long history of interactive displays, buttons, flashing lights, talking robots, immersive spaces, nonfiction media, informational charts, interactive maps, lectures, and live performances. This is from 1939 World's Fair. Entertainment and spectacle were key, but so was the didactic lesson, the scientific demonstration, and they often all worked together. Science, in other words, could be made spectacular. It should be said that lessons on new technology or industrial process are still ultimately lessons. Their corporate ethos does not make them less or unpedagogical. Another reason to situate fairs in the history of multimedia education is that fairs served as grand statements about progress, newness, power, and the massive investments in these fairs invited others to view them as precedent-setting models for technologies and practices that followed. In other words, fairs influenced everything else that came after. For instance, conventional educational institutions like museums and schools have long studied fairs as sites for rejuvenating their own practices. And one last thing about fairs before I get onto it. We tend to think of fairs as temporary and site-specific events, but at least since the 1930s, it's very clear from the research I've been doing, which is mostly focused on the 30s, that fairs themselves operate as a kind of media machine in the largest sense. They generate content that circulates far beyond them for decades. And a quick Google search of World's Fair will bear my case out. So, New York World's Fair. Like at the other World's Fairs, but this one in New York, media and architecture came together across state and corporate pavilions to signal a new age. The computer and space travel figured prominently at many of the exhibits at the fair. Exhibition sites were highly mediated and participant in a networked information ecology. One of the best-known pavilions at the New York World's Fair was the IBM Pavilion, recognized for, among other things, a kind of early iteration of multi-screen experiments, which were very prominent in '67 here in Montreal. These were designed by the designers Ray and Charles Eames, and the film was called Think, but it was a multi-screened, multimedia performance where the theater actually, seats raised up. It was kind of an amazing architectural feat as much as a multimedia experiment. The multi-screen installation was designed to teach fairgoers about managing complex systems, precisely the kinds of things that Charles was talking about. And what was talked about at the time is information overload, so adequating spectators to more and more data, more and more information, more and more stimulation, how to make sense of it, how to navigate it. But the preoccupation with screens can easily distract us from other kinds of multimedia environments at fairs in the 60s. For instance, at the same fair, that's another example of Think. In 1964, for instance, at this fair, Walt Disney's research and development arm, then called strangely WED, or WED, which doesn't make any sense to me now. We call it Imagineering now, because it was renamed later. But the R&D arm of Walt Disney introduced its ongoing and enduring research in animatronics. So it's actually thanks to the 1964 World's Fair that we have to thank for It's a Small World. Charles gave me $50 not to sing the song or show the song. So you may not know, the original It's a Small World exhibit was actually sponsored by Pepsi and orchestrated by Disney as a sponsored event, and it was dedicated to UNICEF. So it had this kind of interesting corporate, deep corporate roots, but articulated to a liberal world organization. So that's an interior shot of that. And of course, for anybody who's been to Disneyland lately, this is also the premiere of the Abraham Lincoln animatronic show that is still at Disneyland. I don't know if it's at Disney World in Florida, but it's certainly still playing in California, where this robot, that is what you're looking at, a robot, does a mashup of Abraham Lincoln's speeches. So immersive exhibits, music, lighting, anthropomorphic machines lured people into historical address and global development narratives inspired by liberal organizations like the United Nations. And both of these now reside permanently at Disneyland parks and throughout theme parks everywhere, not these particular iterations, but animatronics in general. So both of these, I would argue, are examples of what Fred Turner would call democratic surrounds, that is, attempts to create multimedia environments that enabled a new kind of technologically adept citizen ensconced in mid-century liberal ideals. And entertainment here was also fundamental, but that doesn't disentangle it from its pedagogical address or approach. So, what I really want to get to today is a strange little film. But when one works on strange little films, one realizes that you need to situate them to make them a little less strange. So here we go. Here's that effort before we get to my strange film. So I want to talk to you about Futurama. Now, this is technically, in 1964, Futurama #2. And Futurama was a widely touted pavilion sponsored by General Motors. It was talked about as the most popular pavilion at the fair, though I have to say just about every pavilion called itself the most popular pavilion, so sometimes it's hard to parse the rhetoric. Of the 51 million visitors at the New York Fair, 26 million reportedly rode Futurama. So what's important about, and interesting, back to that old and new thing that's always important to think about when we talk about innovation, and not mistake innovation for newness per se, or to not misidentify the kind of newness it is that Futurama in 1964 was actually based on a 1939 exhibit also called Futurama, though sometimes people refer to the 64 Futurama as Futurama 2. The 1939 Futurama was a large-scale, futuristic, multi-mediated diorama. It's a very fancy diorama that brought people through a sizable interior space designed especially to take you on a tour of the future. This is an exterior shot of the GM building in 1939, and these are people queued up around the building. And the architecture of the building was precisely designed to show off how many people were waiting. So the psychology of waiting, the attraction of waiting was built into the architecture itself. The Futurama ride was designed by Norman Bel Geddes, an influential and prominent American designer known for his streamlined aesthetic. His previous training before he entered into the design world was in avant-garde theater, and this imbued many of his designs with a particularly interactive element. He was very keen on using lighting, and the Futurama, the 1939 Futurama, had wired all of the seats with individualized audio. So people moving through this very gargantuan space had individualized voiceovers in their chairs, and it was part of the idea of building up the drama of the narrative. So the diorama itself was animated with thousands and thousands of moving parts. It was very elaborate, and it was of this ride, there was also a film made, and that film circulated for many years also. So it's a very interesting genre of media that emerges from these fair exhibits, which is essentially exhibit films, but many of them were constituted by puppetry and moving dioramas and little, basically 19th century display techniques that were upgraded to a new media age. They're very interesting. Because this Futurama was sponsored by General Motors, you can imagine that the future was a very car-friendly future, replete with super sleek highways, flowing ramps, a lot of corporate benevolence, ideologically complex and utterly unfriendly, I would say, to the class and race dynamics of the era. It was the 1930s after all. Futurama nonetheless turned didactic display into a kinetic, multimedia, and embodied experience. It was a kind of, I think of it as a kind of nonfiction sci-fi, if that makes any sense. The voiceover and supporting materials for Futurama were based on contemporary research. There was a lot of experts say and scientists tell us kind of rhetoric within the voiceover as a kind of sign of its deep roots in the laboratory and industrial R&D in general. And then the other important element of rides like this was the increasing sense that American corporations didn't just have to communicate to people, they had to develop a certain degree of showmanship. And fairs became a really important venue for what was called industrial showmanship. That is the idea that to be a corporation means to always be putting on a show. And this ethos grows out of public relations logics that developed deeply in the 1930s and obviously continue on today. This is just another shot of the old Futurama. So this is the 1964 GM building designed by Louis Kahn. Some of you may be familiar with his work in international style architecture. So in 1964, the Futurama was rebuilt but updated. Rather than travel from 1939 to 1960, which is what the original Futurama did, riders entered a moving train which brought them into an indefinite future in which vacations on the moon and to underwater resorts were commonplace. I just want to show you some of these. This is the trip to the moon. This is a moon rover that you see here in the foreground. This is the underwater resort, and I guess right beside it is an oil drilling facility, which apparently people didn't mind vacationing next to a deep water oil rig. Also, advanced automated highways, so driverless cars were essentially imagined in 1964. sat beside fully automated agricultural projects in the desert. So Rick, this is for you. This is modern California. Like in 1939, multimedia pedagogy was also techno-utopian, far removed from the political disruption in the United States and elsewhere. Futurama 2 carried 72,000 riders a day and featured a dramatic voiceover, which was scripted, which took you on tours also of, this is one of the cars that was automated and driverless on the highway, which is future shopping. Every rider on Futurama 2 received a button that said, "I have seen the future," implicating them in this idea of having really traveled somewhere, given to each diorama rider. This also happened in 1939. This diorama had tens of thousands of moving parts, scored to music and further dramatized with a complex lighting scenario, just like in 1939. In 1964, much like 1939, learning about the future and the place of travel and transportation within it was highly controlled, but also multimedia, kinetic, colorful, sonic, and highly imaginative. It told a drama of innovation, benevolent corporate research and development, and a world in which problems of disease, poverty, and hunger would be solved by science. This was an efficient world filled with ingenuity, innovation, and media experimentation, and it was also made into a very unusual promotional film, which is what I'm going to show you. Now, before I show you, I just want to say, of course, Futurama was a kind of lie. I don't want to say this was good or progressive, but it was what it was. It was innovative, it was dynamic, it was immersive. And it was a multi-mediated vision of a future world made beautiful, soundtracked, and ordered with a wondrous, childlike gaze toward better times. What it reminds us of is that in addition to radical and notable democratic multimedia projects like the Open University, the history of multimedia experimentation is also the history of Futurama and the history of visionary designers like Bel Geddes adapted to corporate public relations imperatives, an idealization of engagement and media that persists today. I sketched here, you know, sometimes when you're teaching at the universities, you feel like people would be happier if you could just sort of convert your course into a theme ride. So I always think, how can I make this more diorama-like? And it is very much in, that's a caricaturization, but it is in the air for certain. Anyhow, the takeaway here may simply be that experimental pedagogy happened in many places across large events and small throughout the 60s, live events and recorded media through big infrastructures, but also very small devices like buttons and pins. Some of these were at the behest of progressive public programs, and others on the whim of complex corporate imperatives. So I just want to show you this kind of unusual film and take you on the tour of the future in 1964. Film designed to get you interested in the future, or Futurama, sponsored by GM.
Welcome to Futurama 2. Welcome to a journey into the future. A journey for everyone today into the everywhere of tomorrow. Let us explore together the future. A future not of dreams, but of reality. It is now tomorrow. On the moon, there is no air to breathe, no rain to fall, no sound that can be heard. Yet here is man, exploring, building his first bridgehead in his span of space. Lunar rovers float magically over powdered plains, range the crater's edge, their elastic train-like bodies conforming to every surface character of the moon. Here are bases of communication and supply, islands of existence built to withstand the melting heat of the lunar day, the shattering cold of the lunar night. Men in space now monitor the Earth, while men on Earth are finding a whole new world of answers to the worldwide needs of man. A diamond brilliance draws us to a frozen shore, to Antarctica, the southern polar cap of the world. Here, nations of the world, speaking the common language of science, probe for the Earth's secrets through countless centuries of ice. In mobile laboratories, form expeditions into the vast white wastelands of the still unknown. And here is Weather Central, forecasting to the world the great climatic changes born in the Antarctic's never-ending winds. Technicians, kept warm within their walls of ice, gather data from the depths of space, from polar winds, surrounding seas, in microseconds, relaying information wherever needed, anywhere on Earth. 3/4 of our Earth lies beneath the cold, still deeps of the sea, a water world in which we now can find abundance far beyond our dreams. Now we can farm and harvest a drifting, swimming, never-ending nourishment, food enough to feed 7 times the population of the Earth. In aquacopters, search the ocean floor to find miles deep, vast fields of precious minerals and ores. And in the deepest trenches of the seas, study at first hand long-hidden secrets of survival. Work easily the rich oil deposits of the continental shelves, while trains of submarines transport materials and goods along the waterways of the undersea. And in warmer seas are new realms of pleasure. A weekend, if you wish, at Hotel Atlantis in the kingdom of the sea. A holiday of thrills and of adventure, of radiant wonders in the sun-bright gardens of the sea. Fabulous coral reefs lead us back to the land, an equatorial land. Now, technology has found a way to control the wild profusion of this wonder world. A jungle road is built in one continuous operation. First, a searing ray of light, the laser beam, cuts through the trees. Then a giant machine, a factory on wheels, grinds up the stumps and jungle growth, sets the firm foundation, forms the surface slabs, sets them in place, and the roadway bed is paved. These forest highways now are bringing to the innermost depths of the tropic world the goods and materials of progress and prosperity, creating productive communities that can enter profitably the markets of the world, and offering to us all enchanting tours through the storybook forests of tropic lands.
In the interest of time, I'm going to stop it there. It's available on the interweb, and I encourage you all to watch these films. They're pretty interesting. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to CCA and the MHRC for their wonderful hospitality. It's a privilege to be here. And oh, right, I have to unbundle. Okay. You know, I generally speak about archives and moving images, but tonight I'm going to stretch and talk about some new research. That means this will probably be a little bit messy. I want to look into an unexamined media project that wasn't centralized or top-down, that began to flourish in the 60s for reasons that had very little to do with learning at first, but evolved, I think, after it failed, evolved into a mutual education project that bridged media, technology, politics, urbanism, community, and do-it-yourself values. Though millions of people have engaged with this medium in one way or another, there's never been a common purpose or goal, and it's actually failed to achieve the emancipatory potential that many people felt it might possess. It's remained informal, crowdsourced, and autonomous, and crucially, it's been almost completely overlooked by history. So to describe this project and to kind of bring it into the realm of media history, I'm going to look away from broadcasting, from organized efforts at education, and from conscious attempts to propagate culture and knowledge to audiences, with a tip of the hat to my co-panelists' contributions to cinema and media studies. I'm going to talk about useful radio, also sometimes known as utility radio. Useful radio. We tend to thematize wireless communication as either broadcasting or as personal communication, but the majority of radio transmissions fall into a different category. Think walkie-talkies, microwave dishes, mountaintop antennas in unfamiliar shapes and configurations. Think pagers, think unmarked cars with multiple antennas, glowing screens in delivery vehicles. Think about messages whose existence you've always taken for granted. The messages that are passed over useful radio networks are intended neither to educate nor enlighten, and in fact are mostly useless soon after they're received. Media as residual as can be, so residual in fact that messages more often survive in transcription than in their original form. Here's a slice of the wireless spectrum, much of which we'll be talking about today takes place in the areas that are dark green, red, blue, and violet. Different frequency bands have different properties and are therefore suited to different applications. Utility radio occupies some of the busiest bands of the spectrum. It assists people to police other people. It helps move goods through space and deploy services in time. It tells humans what machines are doing and machines what humans are doing. It tracks migrating wildlife and hunting dogs that go astray. It's a key element in the communicative and administrative toolbox that expedites the missions of industry and the state. It's both voice and data. It's sometimes carried in the clear, often digitally encoded, encrypted, or obfuscated. And the history of people's efforts to monitor, interpret, decode utility radio messages resides in strange places, in hobbyist newsletters and magazines, and the fragmentary records of online listservs and forums, many of which were never shared with the public. If this history didn't intersect with culture, society, community in singular and sometimes urgent ways, it might not be worth recalling. But I ask you to imagine a sustained and expensive engineering effort to develop, to improve, to deploy useful messaging technologies over many years, beginning really with the first days of wireless. Then imagine a parallel and unfunded effort by individuals to eavesdrop on useful radio that goes back, I think I've traced it back to at least 1914, a long-term effort undertaken by mostly working and middle-class men, with some exceptions, to listen to, decode, and understand the characteristics of messages that were not intended for them. An arms race, really, between message originators and eavesdroppers, perhaps, between those who wish to protect and others who wish to hear and interpret unmediated information generated by all kinds of authorities. What began as simply listening to police radio bulletins broadcast at the top of the AM dial has escalated into a complex of practices that now include such things as reverse engineering, complicated digital radio systems, counter-surveillance, or what has been called by some surveillance, signals intelligence work, travels to the perimeter of classified government sites, and state-of-the-art crypto cracking that almost certainly takes place but is not broadly discussed. Collectively, the interception of utility radio involves millions of people, many of whom share leads, information, and ideas. And this is a hint of the massive, at the massive mutual education project that's developed. I just want to see what this looks like because it's so detailed. You know, there's versions of this online. There are like 40 megabytes you can download. But interception is inevitable because Hertzian wave or wireless transmissions cannot choose their recipients. They pass through space, structures, even our bodies. They quite often manifest where they're neither expected nor desired. when Manhattan Project scientists coordinated preparations hours before the first nuclear detonation at the Trinity site in July 1945, they found that the frequency on which they were transmitting was also used for managing railroad switching in El Paso. And physicists doing top-secret work found themselves competing for bandwidth with freight conductors as their words reached all over the Southwest. So responding to the rise in organized crime in the 1920s and a high homicide rate in the early 1930s, police embraced radio as a means of coordinating resources and reducing response times. Their broadcasts lived just above the AM broadcast band, and listening became a sport in 30s and 40s America. The frequencies you see were published. In some jurisdictions, you needed a permit to listen to police in cars. In New York, the first civilian permittee to drive with a police radio was reportedly Ouija, the photographer, who lived at 5 Center Marketplace opposite the police garage, where he could observe the comings and goings of cars carrying what we would now call the CSI team and race them to crime scenes. When he left that apartment to get married, he gave the lease and his police radio to my uncle, who after the sunset moonlighted as a freelance newsreel photographer. So in the mid-60s, utility radio went mainstream. I attribute this in part to the rapid growth of citizens band radio, which became a huge craze starting in the early 60s and accelerated into the mid-70s, by which time the US FCC was issuing over 1 million licenses a month, and then they gave up. We can see CB as a precursor to today's social media. You know, people's handles resemble today's structured online personas. QSL cards memorialize encounters and relationships in the way people friend one another today. And I want to point out the beautiful Afrofuturist vision from Black Detroit, and Basse du Mineur, a wonderful, one of the many wonderful Quebecois, you know, the Quebecois culture has generated some of the most amazing QSL cards. Look for them online. Radio becomes a means for making community and keeping tabs on the activities of neighbors and bad actors. This lightly regulated party line abetted the growth of many kinds of communities of interest, ranging from insurgent truckers to rural sex workers, and most importantly, socialized people into a new consciousness of telepresence, to listen to the radio that was being made around them. And if you look at quickly through periodicals of the period, you can see CB radios and scanners heavily cross-marketed. And then cheap receivers come on the market, and this is the catalyst. In 1967, Radio Shack introduces these small handheld transistor radios that can tune the VHF utility bands. These were a great deal if you could find your station and the 2 inches of play on the dial. And these radios brought utility monitoring into the mainstream, and they sold very well. And then the next year, the first police scanners go on sale. And these, you know, these don't tune. Since two-way radio communication is short, intermittent transmissions, scanners jump from channel to channel, and they stop when something is going on. Much more expensive. A typical scanner cost about $200. This was a cheap one. And $200 is about $1,400 in today's dollars. So you really need to be a geek or a police buff at that point. But by then, the contours of daily life had changed. This is a clip from a home movie shot by Edsel B. Stallings in his hometown of Detroit during the uprising of July 1967. We know that the urban civil unrest of the mid-1960s prompted a huge federal investment in policing equipment, and I contend that it also made police radio monitoring into a mass practice. I'm going to play a little bit of audio from Newark in 1967. I warn you that it's disturbing, but I think it situates what I'm talking about and sort of takes it out of the realm of something cute and arcane.
Give us a bus at Broome and Mercer. We got a cop hit. Any city bus on the air going to Broome and Mercer. Cop hit. Can we see that? Do you want to... Broome and Mercer! A bus! We got a cop hit! Yeah, we understand. We got it. We're trying to get you one. You want that? Yeah. 513. He must be hit dead. Get down to that Broome and Mercer faster than you're going now. Who do you want?
I'm aware of the distortion that's introduced into this chronicle by presenting only police voices, but I think it's a very interesting piece of data. Note the ad copy, tune in crisis. There's a clear correlation between what's going on in the cities and what's being sold. So scanners come in this complex and conflicted time, the height of escalation in Vietnam, greatest polarization at home. Conservative politicians and populist demagogues call for law and order, a code word for repressive measures against people of color, Black Americans. Black resistance and rebellion is met with white backlash. The U.S. government, the research arm of the Department of Justice, provides R&D funding to electronics manufacturers to develop the handheld police radio, which vastly increases the usage and the airtime of police radio. In Newark, the city we were just listening to, white vigilante groups and their sympathizers monitored police transmissions, and there's sometimes suggestions that they would intervene in situations that they felt threatened their neighborhood. Black Panther Party members in Oakland did what they called patrolling pigs, following around police cars to observe police community interactions like Cop Watch today. Anecdotal evidence that they listened to the police. We don't think, I've seen no evidence about anti-war and progressive organizers of the period doing that, but I have been told that stolen police walkie-talkies were treated as trophies. But most scanner listeners were armchair types who regarded what they heard as entertainment. You know, there's a comparison in a sense to Montreal, which is that newspaper that's no longer with us, Allo Police, you know, which, I mean, I guess you would get excommunicated if you were caught reading that at one point. This was not true with scanners. The messages may have been monotonic, but their nature was as complex as any other medium, and their fascination diffuse and difficult to pin down. Were listeners fascinated by the apocalyptic and random mix of crime, unrest, and disaster that filled the airways? Were people who supported law and order unconsciously seeking indicators of disorder? Were people identifying with authority of its adversaries, or adversaries as pro or anti-statists? Was the attraction to scanning based in part on the fascinating ambient texture of the audio, the alternation between silence and sound, the mixture of words and numbers? Some serious scanner buffs modified their radio to increase the length of the squelch tail, that burst of static at the end of a transmission? Or was it maybe the excitement of privileged, closely held forbidden knowledge? And the broader issues remain fascinating and unexplored. Who was actually listening? Was monitoring motivated by the new demographics of city and suburb? Was it city dwellers, or was it suburbanites who'd fled cities, making a spectator sport out of urban conflict and decline? Was scanning inextricably tied up with racism, or was it coincidental that this technology hit the market at a time of extreme racial tension? We don't know. But a few years later, scanners get smarter. They become programmable. And this may seem like a very small sort of incremental change, but for the first time, it's actually clear what frequency you're tuned into. And this opens up whole new areas. Newsletters begin to get published. There's this period of new sophistication and information and exchange and technical literacy. And by the 80s, very highly sophisticated receivers are available. One of the first veils to fall is the mystery surrounding federal government in the USA, because for a long time, these frequencies were considered deeply sensitive. But then hobbyists began to reverse engineer these systems and compiled these detailed lists. And at first, they were circulated only among trusted individuals, but of course, they went public. The people involved in this project didn't simply stick it to their radio rooms. They traveled to mountaintop sites to locate secret transmitters. They used highly directional antennas to figure out which way the relay links were going. They looked for empty spaces in the spectrum and searched for transmissions where none were supposed to exist. Some hobbyists, not me, even followed unmarked government vehicles back to their bases and rummaged for evidence in dumpsters. And gradually, a matrix of of information emerges that's assembled by people as part of a collective, somewhat uncoordinated project with people who have dramatically varying levels of knowledge. And so the people who self-educate begin to share information that is increasingly sophisticated. And then there's kind of a moral panic about all this, because here's an ad that Motorola placed that was very controversial, showing a sniper tuning into a scanner that's about a year old, and they're introducing the first digital encryption. This was old technology. George Antheil and Hedy Lamarr had invented frequency hopping in 1941. But it was only good for casual secrecy. And the feds ended up spending a tremendous amount of money bringing digital encryption to the air in the early 80s. To this day, no one has publicly admitted to breaking it. But I believe that it's been broken. And so government agencies get harder to monitor, and the interest in the topography and the infrastructure of authority grew, just as Trevor Paglen would later photograph Groom Lake and kindred activities at 20 miles range from outside the security perimeter. Listeners trekked into the mountains surrounding these classified spaces and monitored military aircraft. One highly skilled hobbyist I know actually poured concrete so that he could securely mount his own antennas, and he improved his reception considerably until the security forces said, you know, you can't pour concrete on federal land for yourself. And hobbyists began to look backward as well. They investigated Cold War military and government communication systems, and the Cold War comms listserv, which is currently on its 5,866th digest, published many formerly classified and obscure documents. These were sophisticated discussions. The high-level hobbyists avoided the, conspiracy theorizing, and much of that continues today. This is Ingrid Burrington, who's a journalist and a teacher as well, who's investigated the physical manifestations of internet infrastructure and a kind of, an incarnation of media archaeology that she's quite great at.
Frank Sam, Adam King, boy uncle, easy uncle. Frank Sam, Adam King, boy uncle. Easy, uncle.
So these phonetic messages, this is in situ surveillance of suspected spies under foreign diplomatic cover in San Francisco in the late 1970s. It doesn't really mean anything, and we wouldn't hear it now. I mean, we can't know what it means. But most federal radio aficionados were technically adept, and as such, they were less interested in content than in the challenge of figuring out structure. And so skilled hobbyists ended up mirroring intelligence professionals by engaging in traffic analysis rather than listening. Traffic analysis is pretty interesting stuff. It looks for patterns among messages and investigates their origin, destination, directionality, frequency, length, and other characteristics. It's especially useful when you can't understand the messages themselves. And some of you probably know about how skilled people have used computers and direction finding equipment to deconstruct the number stations on shortwave that are associated with international espionage.
We got a phone call, and the people we're interested in have capability to monitor and utilize scanners, so be circumspect on giving directions, getting where you're going there, okay? Yeah, 10-4.
So this is the FBI supervisor telling people in the field to be careful what they're talking about because the Hells Angels have scanners. There's a little evidence that people monitored themselves. David Koresh and the Branch Davidians probably did, but the community was more focused in technical challenges than intelligence information. So the ability to monitor utility communications has always carried this promise of revelatory potential. Since these messages reveal so much about the internal functions of government and industry, scanning might be part of a suite of strategies to open up institutions, to render their activities more transparent, more accountable, perhaps. A writer who's identified only as the Owl states on a website called Doing Freedom, if fire firearms are liberty's teeth and cryptography is liberty's voice, then radio scanners must surely be liberty's ears. But radio monitoring has only occasionally served as a tool for public revelation and accountability. Counter-surveillance has been a minor element at best. Why? You know, it's complex, but I'd suggest two threads. A history of criminalization of radio interception and encryption, which is a lot more than we can go into today, and the often antagonistic relationship of hobbies, even media-related hobbies, to social change. Scrambling was expensive and undependable. It's much cheaper now, and hackers have publicly documented holes in GSM encryption. Police buy cell phone interception equipment. You can make it. As we all know, Wi-Fi was very quickly hacked, and you can download for free open source tools to break encryption and sniff for passwords. So there's a little bit of history of citizen-driven counter-surveillance. It's intermittent. There's some evidence that activists have made constructive use of information, but I'd assert for the most part it's been squandered. There's a thread I'm going to say a tiny bit about. I've mentioned the Panthers. There's radical environmentalists in the Pacific Northwest who've used this in the service of forest defense. There was a project in Europe where artists and activists intercepted satellite telephone calls and faxes to document and expose transnational corporate activity operating outside the laws of nation states where they did business. The Ruckus Society trained people, activists at Tech Toolbox action camps. This is an activist information network from the Republican National Convention in '04. But this was compromised, and the cops fed disinformation into these messages so that they weren't ultimately terribly useful. A wolf advocate in Alaska monitored tracking devices in order to locate animals and defend them if their existence were threatened, and he recorded radio conversations where state naturalists revealed an anti-lupine bias. The LAPD was racked by scandal when hobbyists revealed, the mobile data transmissions where many officers, sent bigoted and racist messages. There's some examples like this, but none of them have had the effect of an Ed Snowden or a WikiLeaks info release. And it never stops to surprise me that most activists are much less interested in what the state is up to than the state is interested in them. In '09, WikiLeaks published the texts of hundreds of thousands of paging messages sent on 9/11. This is against the law in the US, but it's technically simple. After reading them, Chelsea Manning was convinced, or became convinced, of WikiLeaks bona fides because she believed that it was an authentic NSA dump. In fact, it appears that this was assembled by a hobbyist, and so Manning falsely assumed that WikiLeaks had an in on the NSA and trusted WikiLeaks and the rest is history. The files themselves are quite interesting. The first arrow shows the first pager message sent out by a human after the first tower was hit, and then the second arrow shows the first message sent by a machine. So it's rare. I'm describing the counter-surveillance potential as kind of a failure. And I'm also suggesting that the hobby nature of this limited, there's a self-protective impulse, there's an impulse that seeks to avoid divisiveness, there's the conservatism of people who listen to cops. What I'm suggesting that falls out of all of this is an education project. Hobby activities can be a powerful brake on social change. They can be isolating. They can substitute a concentration on detail for a concern with the bigger picture. They impose a consciously apolitical consensus on practitioners. It doesn't have to be so. Hackers are often quite political. One imagines possibilities, to hold institutions accountable, but we haven't seen it. So today, there's a number of public and private online communities where utility radio information is shared. Some provide basic information, like how to program professional radio equipment for your own use. This is somebody who's like a Motorola fetishist. There's got quite a beautiful collection there. Others discuss complex topics and introduce people who share arcane research interests, who then take it offline. And many of the most interesting communities are open by invitation only. Their sophistication and the reach and success of this shared education project can't be overestimated. Officially, there's still a tremendous amount of information and property to protect. Pull this article down sometime. It's from the Wall Street Journal. It's about how much private property costs. It's kind of wonderful. Monitoring culture isn't going to go away. The traffic that's passing through networks of authority constantly gets richer, more systemic, more invasive. And it's unclear to what extent this will be readable by hobbyists, but the arms race between those who originate messages and those who monitor them will continue. And of course, traffic analysis is always an option. So to sum up, the culture and practice of useful radio monitoring began to flourish in the 1960s, fueled by the new consumer technology, by racialized conflict, and a new consciousness of telepresence. We might add overt racism and the suburban diaspora to the mix, but I think it will take a little work to really draw those connections thoughtfully. Utility or useful radio monitoring has only occasionally succeeded as counter-surveillance, as social practice, as a counter-hegemonic force. The possibility of peeking behind barriers of secrecy and bureaucracy in the interest of making government and police more responsive was generally not realized. And we now know that we cannot rely on body cams to change behavior. And what was left was this mutual education project, born in the turbulent 60s, centered around ever-expanding domains of a very different kind of media literacy that have endured over time and created this international cadre of investigators who collaborate and share their discoveries. I'm hopeful that more of this project's history will surface and be preserved, and that actually its lessons might port over into other domains. But in the meantime, utility radio remains one of the most residual and elusive media forms. It has no archivists, it has no archives. Messages are only rarely preserved, and if so, often for limited times. And we know much, much more about the apparati that produced and transmitted the messages than we know about the messages themselves. In theory, electromagnetic radiation can travel forever. And one might imagine a giant archives of faint but readable earthly transmissions slowly accreting somewhere in the universe. But it's perhaps more realistic and certainly more actionable to think of wireless traces, to imagine wireless traces as still inhabiting the streets where they were first transmitted, as faint and imaginable reminders, faint but imaginable reminders that places and communities bear the burden of their histories. Thank you.
Thank you all very, very much. I'm a fan of speculation, and I couldn't really help myself as you were telling that story. I was having a kind of a fantasy of like a hybrid open university and what you're talking about, like this scanner world where you're tuning in and you're just getting scraps of like you're in the math zone of the spectrum and you're hopping from it's like calculus course to like an abstract topology to someone's teaching long division, just like this soup.
Surfing the university.
Yeah, exactly. But what it made me wonder is about speculation is, do you think we're kind of past the age of these top-down educational projects? Is the future more like what well, of course, you're employed by one, but or is the future more like what Rick has been studying?
I mean, it's funny because I think that there's always the ways in which there are agendas, and there's a lot of labor involved in putting forward agendas, intellectual labor, and to implement its budgets, its institutional changes, and for some of the stuff that I was describing, sometimes it's actually new kinds of classrooms are built, new kinds of architectures, new kinds of designs. So on the one hand, there are those organization of ideas and, what should I say, truths about what the future is going to become, what kinds of funds and resources are needed, what kinds of ideas, and if you will, the kind of work that I study is very much it's the formations of hegemonies, right? It's the formations of dominant ways and agreements about how the world might operate and how it might best unfold in the coming future. And then when I think about, and in a way that's partly some of what Heidee's describing as well, where you can see almost like the spectators are these passive recipients of the spectacle of the future as they sort of move through. But then obviously there are all sorts of cracks. And you can see all of the sort of counter-hegemonic possibilities. Whether or not they're realized is something else, right? But I think that you can see it. And so on the one hand, there are in the work that I do, it's almost like I don't even want to say it's top-down, but the emergence of an agreement about participation, activity, but itself has a kind of disciplinary function. Right. I mean, the idea that we move from, arranged classroom desks and seats, all oriented one direction, to a much more casual bodily relationship to the educational space, doesn't mean that casual body is any less disciplined, right? There's a kind of enforcement of an idea about a relationship between learning and experience and teaching. So you see what I'm saying? Like I think that there's a way that we need to understand, on the one hand, the organization and agreements about about education and media, but then also all of those various inconsistencies that can sometimes produce things that are unpredictable. And one of the things that I like about Rick about your presentation is that it really does show sets of potentials that might at some point be activated, but haven't been, what would be the word, coordinated, I guess. But you can sure see it. It's there, and it's lively, and it's active.
Latent possibilities.
Latent possibility, yes.
Yeah, and for me, listening to Rick and Charles, well, and also love the stuff that you were presenting on the project that you guys did here. There's also we tend to be drawn to the big and the expensive and the spectacular, the architectural.
They leave nice archives.
They leave great archives. They're much easier to research, right? But the small, the evasive, the distributed, the inexpensive, Rick was an important person for promulgating the idea of the ephemeral media, but maybe that's not the best metaphor for all of these things that we're talking about. But we, as thinking people, we need to be aware that they all are part of a larger media ecology, and they aren't uniform, they aren't univocal, and then the human factor is crucial to how we remake them. Like, I teach Hollywood movies in my classes, but it's what we do with the movies that makes the difference, right? And I would say classrooms are still a radical space. They're far more radical than a CB radio or a recorded song. Or classrooms, spaces like this are crucial to how we understand all of this. They're all connected.
Seeing your two talks and then performing mine made me realize that, you were describing media ecologies and situations of defamiliarization. Even a corporate utopia is defamiliarizing because it makes you look at your own world differently. And one might imagine that the ability to communicate freely and to hear what you're not supposed to hear would be defamiliarization. But actually, I think it actually seeks in many ways to reinforce pre-existing opinions. This is what Enzensberger was writing about in the 60s, that media has been defined as one way, and it's sort of already lost. We can't think beyond the norms that have been established. So I think, you're presenting the radical potential, and in some ways I'm presenting the failure,
Well, I'm not sure it's exactly cuts exactly.
That's
like
not where
that,
I thought you were going to go with that.
Yeah, but I mean, there's a concept by media theorist James Thoreau, who describes the situation that we inhabit, this is a few years ago, as that citizenship has become a kind of monitorial function, right? We're monitorial citizens. Now, and it partly had to do with watching television, right? So monitors, but it was also a pushback on the idea that only had to do with passivity, right? There's a way in which there is a function played by paying attention, right? And it came to me as I was watching, because that's part of what's going on there, right? It is people paying attention, right? People listening, right? Listening in where, and it might be unauthorized, and certainly I would imagine that part of the thrill of what's there is that you're not supposed to be, right? At least for some of it, you're kind of, it's a window into an institutional function that you might not be a member of, right? And that operation of paying attention, of monitoring, of staying ready, it is part of that latent potential, right? You don't know what that's going to translate into at what point, right? That process of assimilating the varieties of goings on at varieties of institutions, it might in fact be collected, assembled, and activated at some point, at which point we don't know, and we don't know what's going to be the spark, but it does seem like it's an important, at least initial or first step.
You were talking about classrooms just now, Haidee, and then something else I was thinking about during your talks that was how designed some of these early environments are. Now they're all sort of made of pieces. Of course, universities, many have sort of infrastructural funding deficits and these other things. You get these kind of hodgepodges, whereas the dream was always these like sleek kind of spaces. But I guess I wonder, is that, do you think that's a problem? Like the kind of disappearance of the technology as a self-conscious thing. The fact that these radical spaces are not being, necessarily outfitted in a nice way with a carpet and all these tools.
I'm not sure how to answer that. I mean, like at Concordia, we have all kinds of classrooms. So I don't know that there's one kind happening. And I think there's a return to making and hands-on putzing with things old and new. There's a praxis, that is people, read difficult material and then engage with things. There are conventional lecture style halls where, people stand at the front of the room with microphones like this. So what I like about what I see is, the classroom, as I understand it, is there are external pressures that one needs to resist, obviously. But on the ground, there is a will to protect those spaces. What tech is in them seems less important to me than how those spaces themselves are understood and what you seek to do with them. And I think that wages on, that kind of consciousness about learning as something for people. Machines are just things we use to help us do that. That's what I see around me in the immediate sense. Students still like classrooms too, like the idea that kids just want machines. It's just wrong. It's not right. So I guess I'm a little more hopeful than all of that. But it's not. It's an ongoing thing. It's not settled. It never will be.
Yeah, we have a library in San Francisco, and the great lesson has been that it's not about the collection. It's about the transactional. It's the transactional events that happen between people and between people and us as custodians and people in the collection. That's the lesson. That's what you would want to preserve, even if the books had to be disappeared.
I was just where that came from was this idea of like a kind of a progressive media environment. I was like, that's very unfamiliar to me now.
Meaning you've given up on that?
I think I've just never experienced one. I don't have anything to give up on.
Isn't it possible that there will be a wing, VR, of course, and highly immersive media will be pretty much, in my opinion, taken over by the major media companies who can afford to work with those sophisticated tools. But I think there'll be a territory of it that attempts to redefine the space of learning, and not simply, by using vulgar sensory overload cues. I think we've got another shot at it anyway.
Rick, can I ask you, just in terms of you mentioned a number of times that it's about the challenges of studying the kind of phenomena that you were presenting. Again, very few recordings. It's transcripts are what you're left with. I'm just wondering, how does one approach something like that? I alluded to it very briefly in my presentation, that in the end, the bulk of the media that would have been constructed or made or so on in relationship to this media system is gone. I mean, it's nothing that can be consulted. So in your circumstance, what does one do with that? Are you left with, on the one hand, the transcript, or a sort of speculative approach?
You know, I think it happens on both levels. I mean, you know, you find things. There's much more that's been saved than anybody realizes when you start digging. There's much more out there, at least in the States, because so many of us are hoarders in one form or another. And sometimes people are hoarders without knowing that they are. But I think it's interesting to kind of to work simultaneously in an evidentiary realm, but also to work in a speculative realm, because you know, wireless, and you know, it's an instantaneous medium. It challenges temporality and spatiality in so many ways. Why not just go whole hog and imagine it? Why not imagine that these traces are kicking around in the same way that traces of trauma, you know, don't leave communities very easily. I think it's a way, perhaps it's metaphorical, for thinking about history and place and community.